I spent 31 years becoming invisible, and I did it so gradually that I almost didn't notice until the morning I found myself apologizing to my husband for making coffee too loud. That's when I knew something had gone very wrong. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I was 62 years old, standing in my own kitchen in my own house, whispering an apology because the sound of the coffee grinder had disturbed my husband's phone call in the next room. I remember looking down at my hands on the counter. The same hands that had once written a dissertation on post-colonial French literature. The same hands that had graded hundreds of papers, held office hours, shaken the hand of a dean when I was offered tenure. And thinking, how did you end up here? I had been a professor. That is the part of myself I lost so quietly I barely heard it go. When I met my husband, I was 31 and teaching at a small liberal arts college outside of Philadelphia. He was charming in the particular way of men who are used to getting what they want. Certain, smooth, always the loudest voice in any room. He told me on our third date that he admired strong women. I believed him. I had no reason not to. We married within a year. He was building his consulting firm from the ground up then, and I told myself that the sacrifices I made were temporary. I would take a semester off while he got things established. Then another semester. Then the college found someone else for my position, and my husband said it was probably for the best, that the commute had been wearing on me anyway, and didn't I want to be home more? He made it sound like something I had decided. By the time I understood what had happened, we had a house, a lifestyle, a social world that all orbited around his career. I organized dinner parties for his clients. I managed the household accounts. I kept myself looking the way he preferred and showing up to events on his arm and saying the right things to the right people. I had become, without ever signing anything, his unpaid assistant and his decorative wife in equal measure. He knew when we married that I spoke French. I want to be clear about that because it matters. He knew. I had told him about my years in Paris on one of our first dates, the 2 years I spent there during my doctoral research, living in the 11th arrondissement, shopping at the market on the Rue de la Roquette, reading Le Monde with my breakfast. I had been fluent, not tourist fluent, not ordering coffee fluent. I mean the kind of fluency where you dream in another language, where you think a joke and know instinctively which language it belongs in. He had found it impressive then, the way men sometimes find things impressive before they decide they don't need to keep being impressed. Over the years, he had simply stopped accounting for it. I think what happened is that I stopped speaking French around him, because there was rarely occasion to, and gradually he revised his memory of me into something simpler. His wife. The one who handled the household, not the woman who had once corrected a Parisian waiter's grammar and made him laugh. I don't know exactly when he forgot. I only know that at some point he stopped believing I was capable of things I was, in fact, entirely capable of things I was, in fact, entirely capable of. That is a particular kind of erosion. It doesn't come from cruelty always. Sometimes it comes from a man who looks at you long enough that he stops seeing you. His consulting firm had done well over the decades. He specialized in corporate restructuring, taking struggling companies apart and reassembling them more profitably, which sounds cleaner than it is. In recent years, he had been courting a major partnership with a French industrial group, a family-owned firm based in Lyon that was looking to expand its American operations. The lead contact on their side was a man I'll call Monsieur Renard, not his real name, but fitting. He was the kind of man who missed very little. My husband had been cultivating this relationship for nearly a year. He spoke of it constantly at dinner, the way he spoke of all his deals, as campaigns, as conquests. He had taken a beginner's French course online for about 3 weeks before abandoning it. He hired a translator for the formal meetings. He bought a very expensive bottle of Burgundy to serve at what he called the closing dinner, the dinner at which he expected to finalize the partnership agreement. He decided to hold it at our home. I remember when he told me. He came into the kitchen on a Tuesday evening, poured himself a drink, and said, "I'm having Renard and his colleague over Saturday. I need you to make the lamb and wear the blue dress. Not, would you mind, or I'd like your help, or even, I've invited some people. Just the lamb and the blue dress, as though I were a detail to be arranged alongside the centerpiece. I said I would take care of it. He said, you'll probably be bored. They'll be talking business most of the evening. Just smile and look interested. I said I would manage. He didn't ask whether I remembered any French. He had stopped thinking of me as someone with a past that might be relevant to his present. I spent that week preparing. Not just the lamb, the whole dinner, the table, the flowers, the selection of cheeses I knew would be appropriate for guests from Lyon. I also spent a few evenings doing something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out the books I had packed away in the back of the office closet. My Flaubert, my annotated copy of Les Miserables, a French grammar reference I had used in graduate school. I sat with them in the evenings after my husband fell asleep in front of the television, and I let the language come back the way water finds a channel. Not forced, not manufactured, just remembered. It came back more completely than I had expected. Saturday arrived cold and clear. I spent the morning in the kitchen and the afternoon making the house look the way it needed to look. My husband circled through, adjusting things, offering opinions on the placement of the wine glasses, telling me not to fuss too much. He was nervous in the way he always got before a big deal, sharper, quicker to criticize. At one point he looked at my dress and said, "That works. That works." 31 years of marriage, and that was the register we had arrived at. Monsieur Renard arrived at 7 with his associate, a younger woman whose name I'll give as Céline. She was perhaps 40, impeccably dressed, with the kind of quiet competence that I recognized from my old professional life, the kind of woman who takes notes, misses nothing, and is consistently underestimated in rooms that don't deserve her. My husband welcomed them warmly. He was good at that. The warmth, the firm handshake, the well-timed joke. I had watched him perform it hundreds of times. I took their coats and offered drinks and said the pleasant hostess things, and neither of the guests had any reason to think I understood a word they said to each other in French. We moved to the living room for drinks. My husband sat close to Monsieur Renard and launched into his pre-dinner version of the pitch. Relaxed, anecdotal, building rapport. Céline and I sat slightly apart, and she was pleasant to me in careful, polite English. I was pleasant back. Then Monsieur Renard said something to Céline in French, low and not intended for the room. He said the lamb smelled extraordinary and asked if I had made it myself. She said she believed so. He said, and his tone was warm and genuine, "A woman who cooks like this for a dinner party is someone who takes the people at her table seriously. That matters." I smiled at nothing in particular and sipped my wine. We moved to the table. My husband poured the burgundy with ceremony and delivered a brief speech about the partnership and what it would mean and how much he valued the relationship he had built with Monsieur Renard over the past year. It was a good speech. He had probably practiced it. The dinner conversation moved through business and then to lighter things. Lyon, the American South, travel, food. My husband steered it skillfully. I served and cleared and said the right things at the right moments and was, as I had been for 3 decades, perfectly unobtrusive. Then came the moment. We had finished the main course and I had brought out the cheese. The wine was at that point in the evening where it softens the room. My husband was relaxed. He was confident. He believed the deal was nearly done. He turned to Monsieur Renard and said something in English about the growth projections, and Renard nodded and responded, and then there was a brief exchange between Renard and Céline in French, something about clarifying a term, a detail about the restructuring timeline. My husband waited for them to finish, smiling pleasantly, and then he said something to me in English. He said, "Sweetheart, would you check on the dessert?" It was a dismissal. We both knew it. "Get the wife out of the room so the men can finish the deal." I said I would, and I stood and walked toward the kitchen. I was passing behind Monsieur Renard's chair when my husband leaned toward him slightly and said, in a lowered voice that he clearly believed I could not understand, in French, "Between us, my wife is lovely, but she's not really part of this. She used to teach somewhere, but that was a long time ago. She doesn't really follow business. Tonight she's mostly decoration. I stopped walking. I did not turn around. Celine made a very small sound that might have been a clearing of her throat. My husband continued, still in French, still leaning toward Renard as though they were old friends sharing the particular indulgence of dismissing a woman in her own home. He said, "You'll find this funny. She doesn't speak a word of French. I've had to handle everything myself." I stood with my back to the table for one full breath. Then I turned around. I looked at Monsieur Renard first, not my husband. I looked at him because I wanted to speak to the right person. And then, in French, in the French of a woman who spent 2 years in Paris and 30 years keeping something alive in the quiet of herself, I said, "I apologize for any confusion, Monsieur Renard. I should have introduced myself properly at the beginning of the evening. I'm Eleanor, and I have a doctorate in French literature from the University of Pennsylvania. I lived in Paris for 2 years during my research. I understood everything that was said at this table tonight." The room went very still. I heard my husband's chair shift. I kept my eyes on Renard. I said, "The restructuring timeline concerns me, and I imagine it concerns you as well. The terms as they currently stand place all of the transitional risk on your firm in the first 18 months. I noticed that when I reviewed the documents my husband left on his desk last week." I paused. The ones in the study. He didn't mention that he had shared a preliminary version of the contract structure with a competing firm in New Jersey last month. I saw the email. I was looking for the insurance renewal paperwork. There was a silence that was longer than any silence I can remember sitting inside. Monsieur Renard looked at me for a long moment. His expression was not shock, exactly. It was something more like recognition. He said in French, "How long have you spoken French, madam?" I said, "Since I was 24. My husband knew. Renard nodded slowly. He turned to look at my husband. My husband was the color of the white tablecloth. He started to speak and then stopped. He tried again. He said my name. I said, still calmly, still in French, still looking at Renard, "I'll bring out the dessert now." I made a tarte tatin. I learned the recipe during my first year in Paris. I went to the kitchen. I stood at the counter and I breathed. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me. I had expected them to shake. I plated the tart and brought it to the table. My husband was sitting in a silence that had the texture of something broken. Celine was looking at the tablecloth. Renard was looking at me as I set down the plates, and when I placed his in front of him, he looked up and said, quietly, in English this time, "Thank you, Eleanor, for the dinner and for the honesty." I said, "Of course." My husband said nothing for the rest of the meal. The evening ended with the pleasantries that must be performed at the end of every evening regardless of what has occurred in the middle. Renard thanked me for dinner with a warmth that was unmistakably genuine. Celine shook my hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires. My husband walked them to the door and I cleared the table. The deal, as it turned out, did not close that night. I learned later, through Celine, who reached out to me directly 2 weeks afterward, that Renard had put the partnership on hold pending an independent review of the contract terms. The competing firm in New Jersey was contacted. Documents were reviewed. The preliminary version my husband had shared, without Renard's knowledge, had contained proprietary projections that belonged to the French firm. The partnership never happened. What happened instead, and I tell you this not as the point of the story but as the truth of it, is that Celine asked if I would be willing to consult on a project. She was building out a cultural liaison practice for European firms entering the American market, and she needed someone with academic background and professional discretion who understood both sides of the Atlantic. I said yes. And for the first time in many years, I felt the particular kind of aliveness that comes from using the parts of yourself you had been told to put away. My husband and I separated 4 months later. I won't make that sound simple because it wasn't. 31 years is a long time and there was grief in it. Genuine grief, not just for the marriage but for the version of myself I had allowed to slowly disappear inside it. There were lawyers and long conversations and hard nights. My daughter, who is 34 and has always been perceptive, said to me during one of those nights, "Mom, I wondered when you were going to come back." I didn't know what to say to that. I think I just cried. But here's what I want you to understand, if you are listening to this. The language did not save me. I want to be precise about that. The French was not the point. The point was that for 31 years, I had been the keeper of a version of myself that my husband did not believe existed anymore. I carried it quietly, the way you carry something you've been told has no value, but that you can't quite bring yourself to put down. Every time I read those books in the evenings while he slept in front of the television, every time I listened to a French radio broadcast while I was cooking, every time I let a phrase form in my mind just to feel it, that was not nostalgia. That was maintenance. That was keeping myself whole against the slow pressure of being reduced. There is something particular about being dismissed in your own language, in your own home, by someone who is supposed to know you best. It does not come as a shock after 30 years. It comes as confirmation of something you already knew. What my husband said at that dinner table was not a new wound. It was the name of an old one. And yet, I have thought often about that moment, turning around, choosing to respond. I want to say it was calculated, that I had planned it carefully. But the truth is simpler and stranger. I turned around because something in me finally refused to keep walking. Not because of rage, not because of rage, not because of revenge, but because silence in that particular moment would have been a lie. And I had told enough lies on behalf of that marriage, not dishonest lies, the quieter kind, the lie of pretending not to hear, the lie of pretending not to know, the lie of pretending to be less so, that someone else could feel like more. Monsieur Renard told Celine, and Celine later told me that he had suspected something during the dinner. He said that in his experience, a woman who cooks that well for strangers and says so little is almost always listening. He said he had been in enough rooms, on enough sides of enough tables to know the difference between a woman who doesn't understand and a woman who understands everything and is simply deciding what to do with it. I think about that sometimes. The idea that someone saw me more clearly than my husband did, having known me only for an evening. What I want to say to you, if you are someone who has been slowly made smaller inside a life that was supposed to be yours, is this: the things you kept are still yours. The years you spent quietly maintaining yourself against the pressure of being reduced, those years are not lost. They are exactly what will carry you when the moment comes. You do not have to be spectacular. You do not have to be spectacular. You do not have to have a doctorate, or a talent, or a secret language. What you need, and what no one can take from you unless you surrender it entirely, is the persistent, quiet refusal to finish becoming what someone else decided you were. My name is Eleanor. I am 63 years old. I have a doctorate in French literature, a consulting practice I started from a spare bedroom and a small apartment in the city that is mine in every room. And I make a very good tarte tatin. If this story stayed with you, if it felt familiar in some way that you can't quite name, I hope you'll stay with that feeling. Don't dismiss it. Don't walk it out to the kitchen and leave it there. That feeling is information. Pay attention to it. Thank you for listening.